Hi everybody, how are you today? I've got my microphone connected. I've got a drink next to me, so I may take a sip from time to time. Reading does take a toll on the voice, You might hear the sound of a little dog walking around, shaking his fur, placing his fur. Are you going to lie down? Are you going to listen to the story? All right. Well, he's not responding, so we'll just assume that he is going to listen to the story. All right. So we left off after chapter 2 with Siegfried Farnan was showing the new assistant around. All right. Chapter 3. The long offshoot behind the house had been the servants' quarters in grander days. Here, everything was dark and narrow and poky, as if in deliberate contrast with the front. Farnan led me to the first of several doors which opened off a passage where the smell of ether and carbolic hung on the air. This, he said, with a secret gleam in his eye, as though he were about to unveil the mysteries of Aladdin's cave, is the dispensary. The dispensary was an important place in the days before penicillin and the sulfonamides. Rows of gleaming Winchester bottles lined the white walls from floor to ceiling. I savored the familiar names: sweet spirits of nectar, tincture of camphor, chlorodyne, formalin, salammoniac, hexamine, sugar of lead, liniment, album, percoloid of mercury, red blister. The lines of labels were comforting. I was an initiate among old friends. I had painfully accumulated their lore, ferreting out their secrets over the years. I knew their origins, actions, and uses, and their maddeningly varied dosage. The examiner's voice. And what did the dose for the horse, and the cow, and the sheep, and the pig, and the dog, and the cat? These shelves held the vet's entire armory against disease, and, on a bench under the window, I could see the instruments for compounding them. The graduated vessels and beakers, the mortars and pestles, and underneath, in an open cupboard, the medicine bottles, piles of corks of all sizes, pill boxes, powder papers. As we moved around, Farnan's manner became more and more animated. His eyes glittered and he talked rapidly. Often he reached up and caressed a Winchester on its shelf, or he would lift out a horse ball or an electuary from its box, give it a friendly pat, and replace it with tenderness. Look at this stuff, Harriet, he shouted without warning. Adravan, this is the remedy par excellence for red worms in horses. A bit expensive, mind you, 10 bob a packet. And these gentian violet pessaries? If you shove one of these into a cow's uterus after a dirty cleansing, it turns the discharges a very pretty color. Really looks as though it's doing something. And have you seen this trick? He placed a few crystals of re-sublimated iodine on a glass dish and added a drop of turpentine. Nothing happened for a second, and then a dense cloud of purple smoke rolled heavily to the ceiling. He gave a great bellow of laughter at my startled face. Like witchcraft, isn't it? I use it for wounds in horses' feet. The chemical reaction drives the iodine deep into the tissues. It does? Well, I don't know, but that's the theory. And anyway, you must admit it looks wonderful, impresses the toughest client. Some of the bottles on the shelves fell short of the ethical standards I learned in college, like the one labeled Colic Drench and featuring a floridly drawn picture of a horse rolling in agony. The animal's face was turned outwards and wore an expression of very human anguish. Another bore the legend Universal Cattle Medicine in ornate script. a sovereign remedy for coughs, chills, scours, pneumonia, milk fever, garret, and all forms of indigestion. At the bottom of the label, in flaring black capitals, was the assurance, "Never fails to give relief." Farnan had something to say about most of the drugs. Each one had its place in his 5 years of practice. They all had their fascination, their individual mystique. Many of the bottles were beautifully shaped, with heavy glass stoppers and their Latin names cut deeply into their sides. Names familiar to physicians for centuries, gathering fables through the years. The two of us stood gazing at the gleaming rows without any idea that it was nearly all useless and that the days of the old medicines were nearly over. Soon they would be hustled into oblivion by the headlong rush of the new discoveries, and they would never return. "This is where we keep the instruments." Farnan showed me into another little room. The small animal equipment lay on green baize shelves, very neat and impressively clean. Hypodermic syringes, whelping, forceps, tooth scalers, probes, searchers, and in the place of prominence, an ophthalmoscope. Farnan lifted it lovingly from its black box. "My latest purchase," he murmured, stroking its smooth shaft. "Wonderful thing. Here, have a peep at my retina." I switched on the bulb and gazed with interest at the glistening color tapestry in the depths of his eye. "Very pretty. I could write you a certificate of soundness." He laughed and thumped my shoulder. "Good. I'm glad to hear it. I always fancied I had a touch of cataract in that one." He began to show me the large animal instruments which hung from hooks on the walls. Docking and firing irons, bloodless castrators, emasculators, casting ropes and hovels, calving ropes and hooks. A new silvery embryontrome hung in the place of honor, but many of the instruments, like the drugs, were museum pieces, particularly the blood stick and flame, a relic of medieval times, but still used to bring the rich blood spouting into a bucket. "You still can't beat it for laminitis," Farnan declared seriously. We finished up in the operating room with its bare white walls, high table, oxygen and ether anesthetic outfit, and a small sterilizer. "Not much small animal work in this district," Farnan smoothed the table with his palm, "but I'm trying to encourage it. It makes a pleasant change from lying on your belly in a cowhouse. The thing is, we've got to do the job right. The old castor oil and prussic acid doctrine is no good at all. You probably know that a lot of the old hands won't look at a dog or cat, but the profession has got to change its ideas." He went over to a cupboard in the corner and opened the door. I could see glass shelves with a few scalpels, artery forceps, suture needles, and bottles of catgut and spirit. He took out his handkerchief and flicked at an oroscope before closing the doors carefully. "Well, what do you think of it all?" he asked as he went out into the passage. "Great," I replied. "You've got just about everything you need here. I'm really impressed." He seemed to swell visibly. The thin cheeks flushed, and he hummed softly to himself. Then he burst loudly into song in a shaky baritone, keeping time with our steps as we marched along. Back in the sitting room, I told him about Bert Sharp. Something about boring out of a cow, which was going on 3 cylinders. He talked about her ewer and felon. I didn't quite get it. Farnan laughed. I think I can translate. He wants a Hudson's operation doing on a blocked teat. Ewer is the udder, and felon is the local term for mastitis. Well, thanks. And then there was a deft Irishman, Mr. Mulligan. Wait a minute, Farnan held up a hand. Let me guess. Vomitin. Yeah, vomitin bad, sir. Right. I'll put another pint of bismuth carb for him. I'm in favor of the long-range treatment for this dog. He looks like an Airedale, but he's as big as a donkey and has a moody disposition. He's had Joe Mulligan on the floor a few times. Just gets him down and worries him when he's got nothing better to do. But Joe loves him. What about the vomitin? Doesn't mean a thing. Natural reaction from eating every bit of rubbish he finds. Well, we better get out to Sharps. And there are one or two other visits. How about coming with me and I'll show you a bit of the district? Outside the house, Farnan motioned me towards a battered Hillman, and I moved around to the passenger's side. I shot a startled glance at the treadless tires, the rusty bodywork, the almost opaque windscreen, and its network of fine cracks. What I didn't notice was that the passenger seat was not fixed to the floor, but stood frilly on its sledge like runners. I dropped into it and went over backwards, finishing with my head on the rear seat and my feet against the roof. Farnan helped me up, apologizing with great charm, and we set off. Woo! This is going to be a wild ride. Once clear of the marketplace, the road dipped quite suddenly, and we could see all of the dale stretching away from us in the evening sunshine. The outlines of the great hills were softened in the gentle light, and a broken streak of silver showed where the Darrow wandered on the valley floor. Farnan was an unorthodox driver. Apparently, captivated by the scene, he drove slowly down the hill, elbows resting on the wheel, his chin cupped in his hands. At the bottom of the hill, he came out of his reverie, spurted to 70 miles an hour. The old car rocked crazily along the narrow road, and my movable seat slewed from side to side as I jammed my feet against the floorboards. Then he slammed on the brakes, pointed out some pedigree shorthorns in the field, and jolted away again. He never looked at the road in front. All his attention was on the countryside around him and behind him. It was this last bit that worried me, because he spent a lot of time driving fast and looking over his shoulder at the same time. We left the road at last and made our way up to a gated lane. My years of seeing practice had taught me to hop in and out very smartly, as students were regarded primarily as gate-opening machines. Farnan, however, thanked me gravely every time, and once I got over my surprise, I found it refreshing. We drew up in a farmyard. "Lame horse here," Farnan said. A strapping Clydesdale gelding was brought out, and we watched attentively as the farmer trotted him up and down. "Which leg do you make it?" my colleague asked. "Near 4? Yeah, I think so too. Let's examine it." I put my hand on the foot, feeling how much hotter it was than the other. I called for a hammer and tapped the wall of the hoof. The horse flinched and raised its foot and held it trembling for a few seconds before replacing it carefully on the ground. "Looks like pus in the foot to me." "I bet you're right," Farnan said. "We call it gravel around here, by the way. What do you suggest we do about it?" "Open up the sole and evacuate the pus." "Right." He held out a hoof knife. "I'll watch your technique." With an uncomfortable feeling that I was on trial, I took the knife, lifted the foot, and tucked it between my knees. I knew what I had to do. Find the dark mark on the sole where the infection had entered and follow it down until I reached the pus. I scraped away the caked dirt and found not one but several marks. After more tapping to find the painful area, I selected a likely spot and started to cut. The horn seemed as hard as marble, and only the thinnest little shaving came away with each twist of the knife. The horse, too, appeared to appreciate having his sore foot lifted off the ground, and gratefully leaned his full weight on my back. He hadn't been so comfortable all day. I groaned and dug him in the ribs with my elbow, and though it made him change his position for a second, he was soon leaning on again. The mark was growing fainter, and after a final gouge with the knife, it disappeared altogether. I swore quietly and started on another mark. With my back at breaking point and the sweat trickling into my eyes, I knew that if this one petered out too, I would have to let the foot go and take a rest. And with Farnan's eyes on me, I didn't want to do that. Agonizingly, I hacked away, and as the hole deepened, my knees began an uncomfortable trembling. The horse rested happily, his 1,500 weight cradled by this thoughtful human. I was wondering how it would look when I finally fell flat on my face, when, under the knife blade, I saw a thin spurt of pus, followed by a steady trickle. "There it goes," the farmer grunted. "You'll get relief now." I enlarged the drainage hole and dropped the foot. It took me a long time to straighten up, and when I stepped back, my shirt clung to my back. "Well done, Harriet." Farnan took the knife from me and slipped it into his pocket. "It just isn't funny when the horn is as hard as that." He gave the horse a shot of tetanus antitoxin, then turned to the farmer. "I wonder if you'd hold up the foot for a second while I disinfect the cavity." The stocky little man gripped the foot between his knees and looked down with interest as Farnan filled the hole with iodine crystals and added some turpentine. Then he disappeared behind a billowing purple curtain. I watched, fascinated, as the thick pall mounted and spread. I could locate the little man only by the sputtering noises from somewhere in the middle. As the smoke began to clear, a pair of round, startled eyes came into view. "By God, Mr. Farnan, I wondered what the hell had happened for a minute," the farmer said between coughs. He looked down again at the blackened hole in the hoof and spoke reverently. "It's wonderful what science could do nowadays." We did 2 more visits, one to a calf with a cut leg, which I stitched, dressed, and bandaged, and then to the cow with the blocked teat. Mr. Sharp was waiting, still looking eager. He led us into the byre, and Farnan gestured towards the cow. "See what you can make of it." I squatted down and palpated the teat, feeling the mass of thickened tissue halfway up. It would have to be broken down by a Hudson's instrument, and I began to work the thin metal spiral into the teat. 1 second later, I was sitting, gasping in the dung channel, with the neat imprint of a cloven hoof on my shirt front, just over the solar plexus. It was embarrassing, but there was nothing I could do but sit there fighting for breath, my mouth opening and shutting like a stranded fish. Mr. Sharp held a hand over his mouth, his innate politeness at war with his natural amusement at seeing the vet come to grief. "I'm sorry, young man, by out to have told you that this is a very friendly cow. She allus likes to shake hands." Then, overcome by his own wit, he rested his forehead on the cow's back and went into a long paroxysm of silent mirth. I took my time to recover, then rose with dignity from the channel. With Mr. Sharp holding the nose and Farnan lifting up the tail, I managed to get the instrument past the fibrous mass, and by a few downward tugs, I cleared the obstruction. But though the precautions cramped the cow's style a little, she still got in several telling blows on my arms and legs. When it was over, the farmer grasped the teat and sent a long white jet frothing on the floor. "Capital! She's going on 4 cylinders now." All right, so that is the end of chapter 3. And let's see, we'll go on with chapter 4. Hope you're all doing okay. Everybody's fine. Have a little drink, maybe. Hope you're all still comfy. Chapter 4. We'll go home a different way. Farnan leaned over the driving wheel and wiped the cracked windscreen with his sleeve. "Over the Breckstone Pass and down the Silldale. It's not much further, and I'd like you to see it." We took a steep, winding road, climbing higher and still higher, with the hillside falling away sheer to a dark ravine where a rocky stream rushed headlong to the gentler country below. On the top, we got out of the car. In the summer dusk, a wild panorama of tumbling fells and peaks rolled away and lost itself in the crimson and gold ribbons of the western sky. To the east, a black mountain overhung us, menacing in its naked black hulk. Huge, square-cut boulders littered the lower slopes. I whistled softly as I looked around. This was different from the friendly hill country I had seen on the approach to Derby. Farnan turned towards me. Yes, one of the wildest spots in England, a fearsome place in winter. I've known this pass to be blocked for weeks on end. I pulled the clean air deeply into my lungs. Nothing stirred in the vastness, but the curlew cried faintly, and I could just hear the distant roar of the torrent 1,000 feet below. It was dark when we got into the car and started the long descent into Silldale. The valley was a shapeless blur, but points of light showed where the lonely farms clung to the hillsides. We came to a silent village, and Farnan applied his brakes violently. I tobogganed effortlessly across the floor on my mobile seat and collided with the windscreen. My head made a ringing sound against the glass, but Farnan didn't seem to notice. It's a grand little pub here. Let's go in and have a beer. The pub was something new to me. It was, simply, a large kitchen, square and stone-flagged. An enormous fireplace and an old black cooking range took up one end. A kettle stood on the hearth, and a single large log hissed and crackled, filling the room with its resinous scent. About a dozen men sat on the high-backed settles which lined the walls in front of them. Rows of pint mugs rested on their oak tables, which were fissured and twisted with age. There was a silence as we went in. Then somebody said, "Now then, Mr. Farnan," but not enthusiastically, but politely, and this brought some friendly grunts and nods from the company. There were mostly farmers or farm workers, taking their pleasure without fuss or excitement. Most were burnt red by the sun, and some of the younger ones were tieless, muscular necks and chests showing through the open shirt fronts. Soft murmurs and clicks rose from a peaceful domino game in the corner. Farnan guided me to a seat, ordered 2 beers, and turned to face me. "Well, you can have this job if you want it. £4 a week and full board, okay?" The suddenness struck me. Silent. I was in. And £4 a week? I remembered the pathetic entries in the record. Veterinary surgeon, fully experienced, will work for keep. The BVMA had to put pressure on the editor to stop him printing these cries from the heart. It hadn't looked so good to see members of the profession offering their services for free. £4 a week was affluence. "Thank you," I said, trying hard not to look triumphant. "I accept." "Good." Farnan took a hasty gulp of his beer. "Let me tell you about the practice. I bought it a year ago from an old man of 80. Still practicing, mind you. A real tough old character. But he got past getting up in the middle of the night, which isn't surprising. And, of course, in lots of other ways, he had let things slide, hanging on to all the old ideas. Some of those ancient instruments in the surgery were his. One way or another, there was hardly any practice left, and I'm trying to work it up again. There's very little profit in it so far, but if we stick in for a few years, I'm confident we'll make a good business. The farmers are pleased to see a younger man taking over, and they welcome new treatments and operations. But I'm having to educate them out of the 3 and 6 penny consulting fee the old chap used to charge, and it's been a hard slog. These dalesmen are wonderful people, and you'll like them, but they don't like parting with their brass, unless you could prove they are getting something in return." He talked on enthusiastically of his plans for the future. The drinks kept coming, and the atmosphere in the pub thawed steadily. The place filled up as the regulars from the village streamed in. The noise and heat increased, and by near closing time, I got separated from my colleague, and was in the middle of a laughing group I seemed to have known for years. But there was one odd character who swam repeatedly into my field of vision, an elderly little man with a soiled white Panama perched above a smooth, brown, time-worn face like an old boot. He was dodging round the edge of the group, beckoning and winking. I could see there was something on his mind, so I broke away and allowed myself to be led to a seat in the corner. The old man sat opposite me, rested his hands and chin on the handle of his walking stick and regarded me from under drooping eyelids. "Now then, young man, I've summat to tell thee. I've been among beasts all me life, and I'm going to tell tha summat." My toes began to curl. I had been caught this way before. Early in my college career, I had discovered that all the older inhabitants of the agricultural world seemed to have the idea that they had something priceless to impart. And it usually took a long time. I looked around me in alarm, but I was trapped. The old man shuffled his chair closer and began to talk in a conspiratorial whisper. Gusts of beery breath hit my face from 6 inches range. There was nothing new about the old man's tale, just the usual recital of miraculous cures he had wrought, infallible remedies known only to himself, and many little sidetracks about how unscrupulous people had tried in vain to worm his secrets from him. He paused only to take expert pulls at his pint pot. His tiny frame seemed to be able to accommodate a surprising amount of beer. But he was enjoying himself, and I let him ramble on. In fact, I encouraged him by expressing amazement and admiration at his feats. The little man had never had such an audience. He was a retired smallholder, and it had been years since anybody had shown him the appreciation he deserved. His face wore a lopsided leer, and his swimmy eyes were alight with friendship. But suddenly he became serious and sat up straight. "Now, afore you go, young man, I'm going to tell thee summat nobody knows but me. I could have made a lot of money out of this. Folks have been after me for years to tell 'em, but I never have." He lowered the level in his glass by several inches, then narrowed his eyes to slits. "It's the cure for malenders and salenders in 'osses." I started up in my chair as if the roof had begun to fall in. "You can't mean it," I gasped. "Not malenders and salenders?" The old man looked smug. But I do mean it. All you have to do is rub on this salve of mine, and the os walks away sound. He's better by that." His voice rose to a thin shout, and he made a violent gesture with his arm, which swept his nearly empty glass to the floor. I gave a low, incredulous whistle and ordered another pint. "And you're really going to tell me the name of this salve?" I whispered. "I am, young man, but only on one condition. Thou mustn't tell no one. Thou must keep it to thyself. Then nobody'll know but thee and me." He effortlessly tipped half of his pint down his throat. "Just thee and me, lad. All right, I promise you. I'll not tell a soul. Now what is this wonderful stuff?" The old man looked furtively around the crowded room. Then he took a deep breath, laid his hand on my shoulder, and put his lips close to my ear. He hiccuped once, solemnly, and spoke in a hoarse whisper. "Marshmallow ointment." I grasped his hand and wrung it silently. The old man, deeply moved, spilled most of his final half-pint down his chin. But Farnan was making signals from the door. It was time to go. We surged out with our new friends, making a little island of noise and light in the quiet village street. A tow-haired young fellow in shirt sleeves opened the car door with natural courtesy, and waving a final goodbye, I plunged in. This time the seat went over quicker than usual, and I hurtled backwards, coming to rest with my head among some Wellingtons and my knees tucked underneath my chin. A row of surprised faces peered in at me through the back window, but soon willing hands were helping me up, and the trick seat was placed upright on its rockers again. I wondered how long it had been like that, and if my employer had ever thought of having it fixed. We roared off into the darkness, and I looked back at the waving group. I could see the little man, his Panama gleaming like new in the light from the doorway. He was holding his finger to his lips. And there we have the end of chapter 4. I'm going to leave you here for now, and we'll continue on with chapter 5 and 6 in the anon. I hope you enjoy my reading, and I will see you again in the next one.